Fetter Lane is a street on the western boundary of the historic City of London, in the ward of Farringdon Without. It runs between Holborn in the north and Fleet Street in the south, and it was here, in 1666, that the Great Fire of London was finally brought under control. Fetter Lane is in that area of London that sits between the two poles of the city's power. Westminster in the west, where laws are made, and the City of London to the east, where money is made. Around the lane are found lawyers and academics, and until quite recently, this was a home for London's journalists too. Where Fetter Lane meets New Fetter Lane stands a statue to a former alderman of this ward, John Wilkes. The statue was erected in October 1988 by self-confessed admirers of Wilkes, and the inscription on the plinth celebrates John Wilkes as a champion of English freedom. There can be little doubt that Wilkes was that. As not just an alderman, but also a member of Parliament, Sheriff, Chamberlain, and Lord Mayor of London, Wilkes was a man whose name is indelibly associated with both political radicalism and the cause of liberty. Wilkes was a remarkable man. On the one hand, he was a cultured, charming, and courageous man of high-minded principle. He read and wrote French and had excellent Latin and Greek. Late in life, he even published an edition of Catullus's poems and Theophrastus's characters. He amassed a considerable collection of books, and he urged the government of his day to found a copyright national library and a national art gallery. He was good company, popular and witty. When the Earl of Sandwich declared that Wilkes would die either on the scaffold or of the pox, Wilkes replied that must depend on whether I embrace your lordship's principles or your mistress. On the other hand, Wilkes was untrustworthy, unsympathetic, unfortunate-looking, and a man of the lowest possible morals. He was financially insolvent for most of his life, and he was not above desperate measures to alleviate his plight. Money raised for the Foundling Hospital in London, of which he was a governor, and for the militia in Aylesbury, for which constituency he was MP, for example, found its way into his pocket. Despite his missing and uneven teeth, which rendered his speech almost incomprehensible at times, his jutting jaw and very obvious squint, which is actually captured on this statue, he was also a rake and a womanizer. He had at least 2 illegitimate children from relationships with a string of mistresses, and famously claimed that he could talk away his face in half an hour. He was responsible, either solely or together with his friend Thomas Potter, for writing a poem called An Essay on a Woman, a parody of Alexander Pope's An Essay on Man, which has been described as the dirtiest poem ever written in the English language. This poem, which as we shall see, was used by his opponents to bring Wilkes down, was performed before a society called the Monks of Medmenham, which Wilkes had founded. As far as we can tell, the main activities of this society appear to have comprised gluttonous feasting, crapulous drinking, and extraordinary sexual shenanigans, perhaps even involving orgies. Well, it all goes on, doesn't it? The point here is that Wilkes was one of those characters who defy categorization as one of history's goodies or baddies. Wilkes was born in 1725, not 1727 as we see here, and as Wilkes himself claimed, in Clerkenwell. His father was an Anglican malt distiller, his mother was a dissenter whose father had been a tanner from Bermondsey. They had done well for themselves, and the family were comfortably off, but it was still a modest enough background. Wilkes's parents recognised his talents early on, and he was sent to board at school in Hertford, where the young John Wilkes excelled. From here in 1744, he went to the University of Leiden, which was a popular destination for young British gentlemen at the time. Wilkes seems to have spent most of his 3 years at Leiden whoring and drinking. He returned to England in 1747, whereupon he entered into an arranged marriage with Mary Mead. Mary came from a wealthier background than Wilkes, and as a result of their marriage, he became Lord of the Manor at Aylesbury and lived the life, at least at times, of a country squire. They were not a happy couple, however, and less than 10 years later they separated. Their daughter Mary, who was also known as Polly, lived with her father, and Wilkes was devoted to her for the rest of his life. In 1757 and then again in 1761, Wilkes was elected as MP for Aylesbury. He won these elections with the liberal payment of bribes to the constituency's small electorate. Then as now, Great Britain was a constitutional monarchy in which sovereignty was vested in Parliament. Since the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the subsequent Bill of Rights, Parliament had to meet regularly after free elections, and taxation could not be raised without its consent. Free speech was guaranteed in Parliament, and after the Licensing Act had lapsed in 1695, there existed a largely free press. However, we should not think that this was a representative democracy in the sense that we understand it today. Seats in the House of Commons were unevenly distributed, and there was a bewildering array of restrictions to the franchise. London was a case in point. In the middle of the 18th century, there were almost 750,000 souls living in London. This mass of humanity was represented by just 10 MPs. In the historic City of London, an electorate comprising perhaps 20,000 or so liverymen elected 4 MPs. In neighbouring Westminster, maybe 10 to 12,000 men in Scott and Lot formed the electorate, whereas in Southwark and Middlesex, the franchise was restricted to 40-shilling male freeholders. Each of these 3 seats, each home to over 100,000 people, returned 2 MPs, which was the same number of MPs that represented the constituency of Old Sarum in Wiltshire, home to about half a dozen people. London was the most underrepresented place in the country. Wilkes's initial political career was undistinguished and lacklustre. In the early 1760s, however, he began to make a name for himself as a writer, particularly as an anti-government polemicist. In 1762, John Stuart, 3rd Earl of Bute, a Scotsman and favourite of King George III, became Prime Minister. He was unpopular in England for 2 main reasons. He was a Scotsman and a favourite of the King. Once Bute concluded the Treaty of Paris with France in 1763, which brought an end to the 7 Years' War, his opponents had further cause to attack him, this time for being too lenient with the defeated French. The most biting attacks came in the North Briton newspaper, a name chosen as a counterblast to the Briton newspaper published by the government. The North Briton was in many ways something like the Private Eye of its day. Certainly no one was beyond criticism or parody. Wilkes was one of the driving forces behind this newspaper, and at times he sailed close to the wind, narrowly avoiding prosecution but becoming embroiled in trouble in other guises. For example, in 1762, he fought a duel with Lord Talbot, steward of the royal household, in which honour was satisfied on both sides. And he famously and publicly crossed swords with William Hogarth, who had his revenge on Wilkes in a brilliant caricature in 1763. On the 23rd of April 1763, John Wilkes finally overstepped the mark. In North Briton number 45, he turned his ire on the new Prime Minister, George Grenville, for preparing a King's speech which was, according to Wilkes, the most abandoned instance of ministerial effrontery ever attempted to be imposed on mankind. Although Wilkes spoke for many in London, particularly among the common sort, he had gone too far. 3 days later, a general warrant was issued for the arrest of the authors, printers and publishers of the North Briton for the publication of a seditious libel. Well, this stirred up a hornet's nest. The use of general warrants like this, that is, warrants with no named suspects, was already controversial. Over the space of the next 3 days, 49 men and boys were arrested for their part in printing and publishing the newspaper. To many people, this was exactly what was wrong with general warrants. By allowing the authorities to cast such a large net, they could be used to intimidate lawful criticism. Moreover, while everyone knew that Wilkes was the driving force behind the newspaper, since almost all its articles had been published anonymously, how could his authorship be proved? Indeed, when Wilkes was arrested on the 30th of April and taken to the Tower, he was quick to protest his innocence. At first, Wilkes shrugged off the accusations by claiming parliamentary privilege. This defence was upheld, and when he was released within a week, his supporters took to the street shouting, "Wilkes and Liberty!" lighting bonfires and setting off fireworks. But his opponents were not done. In November that year, Lord Sandwich read sections of Wilkes's obscene poem, an essay on a woman, which Wilkes had been careless enough to print in a handful of newspapers before an audience of shocked and disgusted parliamentarians. Indeed, so shocked and disgusted were they that, when Sandwich stopped reading the poem, many of them demanded he read more. Listeners to this channel I know are not the sort to clamour for smut, so I shan't do a Lord Sandwich here. In any case, gentle listener, were I to read the more salacious sections of this poem for you, and let's be honest, they're the best bits, then I would have to mark this video as containing adult content. The point is that Wilkes had been attacked as a pornographer, and this contributed to the decision of the House of Commons that month that Wilkes was not only guilty of seditious libel, but that he was not entitled to claim parliamentary privilege as a defence. Things went from bad to worse when Wilkes fought another duel, this time with Samuel Martin, a man who accused Wilkes of being a cowardly rascal, a villain and a scoundrel, in which duel Wilkes was badly injured. Attacked on what must have seemed like all sides, he fled to France by the end of the year. From 1764 to 1768, Wilkes lived in exile, mostly in Paris, where he was a popular figure in the fashionable salons. He also travelled around Europe, and he even spent 2 months in Geneva with Voltaire. But this quadrennium was a difficult period for Wilkes. He had been expelled from the Commons, outlawed, and he was, more often than not, penniless. He did score some victories from abroad. He won compensation both for himself and for some of the printers who had been arrested in 1763. And in November 1765, the use of general warrants was finally declared unlawful. But what Wilkes wanted more than anything was to clear his name and come back to Britain so that he might get some money together. In both 1766 and 67, he returned to England to try and obtain a pardon. The authorities knew of his presence in London, and while his attempts at getting a pardon were unsuccessful, they did not dare arrest him for fear of rousing his supporters. Wilkes finally returned for good in February 1768, promising to surrender to the Court of King's Bench at its next sitting in April, while also declaring his intention to stand for Parliament at the forthcoming election. That election took place in March 1768. Although he was defeated in London, Wilkes topped the poll for the seat of Middlesex, where there was famously a more radical electorate. The vote itself was a boisterous affair, and the festivities continued in the same vein. Wilkes's supporters celebrated his win by rioting in London and smashing Lord Bute's windows. Not for the first or the last time, the shouts of "Wilkes and Liberty" were heard on the streets of London. In April, as promised and as we can see here, Wilkes surrendered to the Court of King's Bench. But on his journey to prison he was freed by a mob of his supporters on the recently built Westminster Bridge. However, Wilkes knew that he could not remain at large. He therefore spent that evening celebrating with his supporters before he quietly turned himself in. When Parliament convened in May, a crowd of Wilkes's supporters gathered outside the prison in expectation of conveying their hero to Westminster to take up his seat. Unfortunately, violence soon broke out, and soldiers guarding the prison shot between 7 and 10 people. 1 month later, a resolution of sorts was reached. Wilkes was sentenced to 2 years in prison, 1 year for the seditious libel and 1 for obscene publication. If this time could pass without incident, then there would be something of a clean slate. That was, however, not to be. Wilkes continued to stir trouble from inside prison, and in December 1768 a by-election was held in Middlesex after the death of George Cook, the man who had come second to Wilkes in March, and who had thus been elected as the constituency's second MP. This poll, which again saw a great deal of violence, was won by Sergeant John Glynn, Wilkes's counsel. For the cabinet this was too much to bear. They thus sought Wilkes's expulsion from Parliament, which was quickly achieved. This led to one of the most farcical electoral situations ever seen in British politics. At a by-election for the seat held in February, Wilkes, despite being in prison, was duly returned unopposed as MP. The Commons refused to accept this election and ordered that a subsequent by-election be held. The result was the same. Wilkes was again victorious. Wilkes's supporters celebrated both victories with more rioting in the city in support of their man, and in March, when 130 coaches filled with wealthy city merchants set out for St James's Palace to present a loyal petition to the king, Wilkite mobs attacked the procession so violently that only 22 battered coaches finally made it to the palace. In April there was a third by-election, this time one in which Wilkes faced an opponent, Colonel Henry Luttrell. Unsurprisingly, Wilkes won a fiercely contested election. This situation was clearly untenable. As far as the majority of those in the House of Commons were concerned, the voters of Middlesex just kept doing the wrong thing. Thus, not for the first, or indeed the last time, the Commons set its face against the wishes of the electorate. They voided every vote cast for Wilkes and announced that Luttrell had won. Protests and petitions flooded in, and the ensuing controversy helped to bring down the Duke of Grafton's government. But Luttrell did take the seat, and Wilkes sought a different political path. If Britain was a partial and incomplete democracy, the same was true of the City of London's municipal government. London had long since expanded beyond its historic bounds, but its administration had yet to adapt to this reality. In most of Southwark and Bermondsey, the East and West Ends, and the northern suburbs, the old parish vestries administered newly urban areas. Whereas the historic City of London, that is the area covered by the Roman and medieval city, was governed through its own administrative structure, which had evolved in the Middle Ages and which was centred in the city's medieval guild hall. The most important authorities in the city were the Lord Mayor and the Court of Aldermen. There were 26 aldermen, each representing a ward of London or the borough of Southwark, and the Lord Mayor was chosen yearly from their ranks. They were the civic magistrates, the grandees of London's government. Below them, and responsible for the day-to-day running of the city, was the Court of Common Council, with its 200 or so common councilmen. Other important officers in the city included the 2 sheriffs, London's principal judicial officers, and the Chamberlain, who was essentially in charge of the city's finances. The franchise for electing the alderman, the Lord Mayor, common councilmen, sheriffs, Chamberlain, and the city's 4 MPs varied. But at most, just over 20,000 voters could take part in any given election, at a time when the population of the city may have been 150,000 strong. It may seem an oligarchic and unrepresentative system to us, but tens of thousands of Londoners participated and held office in the city's networks of livery companies, parish vestries, and charitable institutions. As we have seen, disorder and violence were common enough features of politics and protest in the early modern city. but it was essentially a stable polity and society. It was into this ancient and labyrinthine structure that Wilkes now launched himself. In 1769, Wilkes was elected as alderman for the large but poor ward of Farringdon Without. As with almost everything in Wilkes's career, it was not without controversy. Wilkes was still a prisoner and encumbered with massive debts. In February 1769, a society called the Gentlemen Supporters of the Bill of Rights had been formed with John Glynn and John Horne Tooke, friends of Wilkes, instrumental in its establishment. Among its aims was the raising of money to pay Wilkes's creditors as a result of the debts he had incurred through repeated persecutions. The society soon split, however, over Wilkes's attempts to prioritise the payment of his debts over other calls on the society's funds. And the foundation of the society led to the absurdity of it campaigning to end bribery in elections when Wilkes, its leader, had twice bribed his way to electoral success in Aylesbury. Well, no one said that Wilkes was a flawless hero. There remained questions too over the legality of a serving prisoner being elected to aldermanic office, and this election was another that was held more than once. The good people, or at least the good voters, of Farringdon Without were clear, however, that they wanted Wilkes and no one else. When he was released from prison in 1770, Wilkes took up office as alderman and rapidly advanced along the city's cursus honorum. In 1771, he was elected as one of London's sheriffs. In the next 2 years, he topped the mayoral poll, but on each occasion the Court of Aldermen exercised its right to pick another candidate, leaving Wilkes furious. But following some careful preparation by Wilkes and another convincing victory in 1774, the aldermen had little choice but to accept him as Lord Mayor of London. Just for good measure, in the same year he was again returned as an MP for Middlesex. Finally, in 1779, he was elected Chamberlain of London by a massive majority. We've already seen how popular Wilkes was with the 18th-century Londoner in the street, but we should not breezily ascribe his success in London's politics to this popularity. As sheriff, Wilkes was acclaimed by many for his criticism of the overuse of the death penalty and the packing of juries by the government. He also won praise for improving the conditions in which prisoners were held in Newgate Jail, and even for acting against the cruelty shown to animals by some at Smithfield Meat Market. One of Wilkes's biographers has described his mayoralty as one of the most splendid in London's history. Although he was not rich, Wilkes was always generous, and he cut quite a figure as Lord Mayor. As he had done as sheriff, he also took his responsibilities seriously, regulating food prices, showing charity to prisoners, and, rather ironically, campaigning against prostitution. There can be little doubt that he won respect across the board in London, and that he was a popular Lord Mayor. As he was not married, his daughter Polly served as Lady Mayoress, and their devotion to each other was also something that went down well. As Chamberlain, Wilkes impressed, and no doubt surprised, many in London with his commitment and sedulity. A younger John Wilkes may very well have abused his position as chief financial officer in the city, but while he benefited from the lucrative emoluments that came with the role, he was also an energetic and vigorous Chamberlain who attended seriously to his duties. In 1776, as MP for Middlesex, Wilkes proposed the first ever motion for parliamentary reform, calling for greater representation for London, industrial towns and underrepresented counties, and for the rotten boroughs to lose their members. The motion was, of course, defeated, but electoral reform would be perhaps the single most important political cause of the next 150 or so years. In this, Wilkes was a pioneering radical. As well as being a political radical, Wilkes also had a lifelong commitment to the cause of liberty. To be sure, we must be careful not to conflate the two. Radicalism and libertarianism are not the same thing. Upon his release from prison in 1770, he joined criticism of King George III for paying too little heed to public opinion, and while he was no Republican, he was sensitive and sympathetic to American demands for freedom, and he wanted to see conciliation in the colonies and not confrontation. He famously urged the government not to use force against the rebels in America, warning that "men are not converted, sir, by the force of the bayonet at the breast," and that the Americans were neither to be cozened nor by violence deprived of either liberty or property. He was one of those pragmatic Londoners who, once it had become clear that the American colonies were lost, urged the government and Parliament to accept the situation. Wilkes had always believed in religious liberty. Undoubtedly, growing up in a household with parents who differed in matters of religion was a factor in Wilkes's commitment to religious toleration. But we should not underestimate his dedication to personal religious liberty in all its guises. Both his parents were Protestants, but Wilkes refused to take part in protests against the establishment of the Roman Catholic Church in Quebec. In 1779, he supported the Dissenters' Relief Bill, stating that "I wish to see rising in the neighbourhood of a Christian cathedral, the Turkish mosque, the Chinese pagoda, and the Jewish synagogue, with a temple of the sun. The sole business of the magistrates is to take care that they did not persecute one another." His most famous and successful efforts during the 1770s, however, were fought in the name of the freedom of the press. As we have seen, press licensing had lapsed in 1695, and there was essentially a free press in 18th-century Britain. Indeed, according to Jürgen Habermas, the German philosopher and theorist, by the 1730s the press in Britain had established itself as a genuinely critical organ of a public engaged in critical political debate, as the fourth estate. That is, British newspapers and journals had become as important a component of the political system in Britain as the other three traditional estates, the nobility, the clergy, and the commons. And the existence of a free press was both a cause, but also a consequence of the emergence of a bourgeois public sphere. But it was still illegal in the press to report proceedings from the House of Commons. Many members, understandably, thought it important that they could speak freely and even criticise the king and his court, and not fear that every word might be reported in the newspapers and journals. However, with regular elections and in a society where people were free to discuss politics, not just in newspapers and journals, but also in the coffee houses and other social fora, interest in the business of Parliament had grown, and the press had found ways around the restrictions. The authorities usually turned a blind eye to this, as long as the offence was not too serious and little damage was done. In February 1771, however, the Commons flexed its muscles and summoned two printers from the City of London to the bar of the House to answer charges of reporting on Commons business. The printers did not appear, and warrants for their arrest were duly issued. Wilkes saw his chance. He argued that, according to the ancient custom of the City of London, only the City Corporation had the authority to carry out arrests in the city, and he urged his fellow aldermen to defy the Commons, which they duly did. Wilkes himself then engineered the arrest of one of the printers, which gave him the opportunity to free him, finding that there was no charge to answer. What he then did was bring a contrived charge of unlawful arrest against the man who had arrested the printer in the first place. Wilkes was determined to prove that when it came to restricting the freedom of the press to report on parliamentary business, the law was an ass. But amidst this seemingly knockabout farce, there were imprisonments and riots, and in one outbreak of particularly severe violence, the Prime Minister Lord North was lucky to escape with his life. Realising that there was little they could do to contain the commotion, the Commons backed down, and thenceforth the press could report freely on parliamentary business. It was another notable victory in which Wilkes had played an important part. In the 1770s, Wilkes seems to have grown into his role as a champion of an often unrepresented or unenfranchised middling sort. He became a better public speaker, and he understood the power of the press. As such, he learnt how to tailor his speeches so that they read as well in the papers as they sounded in the House of Commons. Many argue that Wilkes mellowed and became less radical as he grew older, but I am not so sure. True, in 1780, he condemned and helped to suppress the anti-Catholic Gordon riots, the worst outbreak of public disorder that London has ever seen. But a younger Wilkes would, I believe, have taken the same stand as he did in 1780. He had always believed in religious toleration. True too that when a woman passed him in the street and shouted, "Wilkes and Liberty," he is meant to have replied, "Be quiet, you old fool, that's all over long ago." But that does not mean that he had repudiated his political principles, only that the cause of Wilkes and Liberty was a moment that had passed. Besides, how many times must he have heard that from his fans in the street? He must have felt like Paul McCartney hearing Hey Jude sung to him. In fact, as ever, Wilkes had his finger on the political pulse in London. Revolutions, first in America and then France, did temper the enthusiasm for radicalism in London. Wilkes, for example, was horrified by what the French Revolution became. He was not alone. After 1780, many Londoners like him swung behind the younger Pitt, who espoused moderate political reform. Perhaps rather than imagining Wilkes moving away from radicalism, we should instead recognise Wilkes remaining constant while radicalism moved away from him. No reasonable person could argue that the horrors and excesses of the French Revolution after 1792 were an expression of the same political radicalism that Wilkes advocated over the course of his career, for example in his support for male suffrage or for more equal representation. Certainly, when radicalism came to be associated with republicanism, Wilkes would have none of it. Nor should we assume that Wilkes changed his mind when it came to his philosophy of liberty either. In this, whether fighting for freedom from arbitrary arrest, freedom of the press, or for freedom to practice one's own religion in peace, he remained constant too. Wilkes lost his parliamentary seat when he refused to stand in the election of 1790, but he remained Chamberlain of London until his death on Boxing Day in 1797. He was buried on the 4th of January in Grosvenor Chapel, South Audley Street, Westminster, where he is commemorated as a friend of liberty with this plaque. This is, of course, a similar inscription to that found on his statue in Fetter Lane, where he is remembered as a champion of English freedom. The statue is now one of several dozen talking statues in both London and Manchester. This super initiative, pioneered by the charity Sing London, aims to bring many of the memorials found in our cities to life. As we can see here, any passerby with a smartphone can scan or enter a code and hear a brief biography of and introduction to the person commemorated on the plinth. Those who listen to Wilkes' statue will hear Jeremy Paxman give voice to the ugliest man in England in a baldy and scornful précis, but also one in which Wilkes' vivacity and force of character is made plain. There can be little doubt that Wilkes had his faults. Like Simon de Montfort, who came in the 13th century to head England's first political revolution, John Wilkes was dangerous, a demagogue, a radical, and a man who was often culpable of acting in his own interests as much as those of the wider political community. But both men were charismatic and charming, and both men changed British politics forever. In Jerry White's words, John Wilkes single-handedly advanced the cause of liberty, the rule of law, and the widening of democracy in ways that have proved irreversible. Well, that's no bad legacy.